From our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
This is the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric.
The media is a constantly evolving spectrum, one that, since the beginning of time, has become increasingly efficient and advanced with each passing year. The word media derives directly from Latin, which was originally translated as an intervening agency, means, or instrument. Today, the meaning has changed and is now defined as a means of communication that reach large numbers of people, such as television, newspapers, and radio. However, many will argue that it continues to uphold its original Latin translation as basically a device used to control a people. From the newspaper to television, the media both changes in some ways and remains similar in others. 5 centuries ago, a spark was ignited and the inferno that is media revolution began. In Renaissance Europe, for the first time, news was no longer just being passed by word of mouth. Amongst merchants, handwritten newsletters were circulated on everything from politics and wars to social customs and human interest. It was not until 1400 when the first printed news were seen in Germany in the form of pamphlets that discussed highly sensationalized topics. Soon they were everywhere, and by the late 1600s it finally spread to America, where in 1690 the first newspaper was published called Public Occurrences. This paper, however, having been published without any permission from the government, was quickly shut down, the publisher arrested, and all copies burned.
It wasn't until 14 years later, in 1704, when John Campbell published a new paper titled The Boston Newsletter. Although it was almost another complete failure and was scarcely distributed, it was the first time in American history a paper had been published without being banned. By the beginning of the Revolutionary War in 1775, it released a dozen papers in print all across the 13 colonies, and by the end, with the widespread use of the printing press, there were many more papers covering all shades of political opinions. As technology for the printing press improved, the amount of money needed to produce a paper decreased, and like wildfire, the newspaper spread across the rapidly expanding America, and to this day remains a rather influential part of American media. As time wore on, the iconic picture of Dad coming home from work to read the newspaper soon became quintessential. However, it was time to broaden the horizons of the media's influence. Radio was the first medium that marketed to every member of society, but this was primarily during an era when consumerism was not the main focus of an American's life. All this changed with the invention of the television. In 1948, only about 1 in every 10 Americans had one. This number, however, was short-lived, for within just a few years, it was an oddity not to have one. Soon, with so many people having them, the stage was set for a new era of media. In 1948, we see the beginning of arguably the most trusted news agency in America, CBS, with the first news anchor, Douglas Edwards, who until 1962 hosted the CBS Evening News when a well-known American icon, Walter Cronkite, took over and captured quickly the full trust of the American people. It is during this age of news when people felt they could really trust what they were watching. The news during this time covered in depth many important things such as the first moon landing, presidential speeches, Vietnam, and various assassinations, including that of civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr.
Writing its turn, it's edited, and it's printed by August each year. So,
but you prominently use the term censored. And a lot of people in America are going to say, hey, we have a free press. It's a free market system. Does censorship really exist?
Of course. Because none of these stories, and they're very important stories, were covered by the mainstream media. Now, how that happens, this is where we have to take a broader understanding of what censorship means. We refer it to as any interference with the
Media was at its very finest, pure, seemingly untainted information streaming to a knowledge-hungry public. Things that were important and had substance were covered in length, and miraculously, the people of America trusted it. Some people, even to this day, would call Walter Cronkite the most trusted man ever in America. On the other side of the spectrum, the media's transition to the television is not completely a positive one. From then until today's news, things have become increasingly watered down and less believable. Instead of spending time on important events, today's news focuses mostly on unimportant topics such as royal weddings, sports athletes, senseless crimes, and who could forget, pop culture. It has become apparent that we simply cannot focus on anything for more than 30 seconds that is not filled with flashy graphics and fluff. Stories involving things like political corruption, the Iraq War, and the state of our union are simply not aired. This brings up a good question. Is the media censoring us, or are we censoring ourselves?